Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our final installation of Race and Conversations about Race in America webcast. I'm Dr. Rob Shelby, the Chief Diversity Officer for the University of Evansville. I've made this statement a number of times, and some of you have seen it in the announcement, and I think it's important to just to use this as a reminder to give context to why we're having these conversations. We're living in unprecedented times with social impacts from COVID-19, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. There have been calls for reforms to policing and criminal justice. And our guest today is part of the reason why I invited him. And I'm very pleased that he accepted our invitation is for that very reason there, talking about policing and criminal justice. We've seen instances of racial violence. There have been questions and issues related to voter access for state primaries in the lead up to the presidential election. The removal of Confederate statues and the emergence of social movements such as Black Lives Matter. There have been debates about reparations, and of note, one city in the South in particular has passed a policy that is going to allow reparations to take place. So we'll be really paying attention to how that unfolds. There's been so many other events and things taking place within our society. And the thing that's really been piquing my attention is that all of them have a race dimension to them. And that is why we're having these conversations. And I've heard from our students, I've heard from many of our employees and folks in the community that this is of importance to them. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that we continue these conversations. So today is our final installation in our summer series on race in America. Like those before it, today's session will consist of a 1-hour block of time with discussion and Q&A and time for comments. With a UE community member about race and its relationship to and impact on a specific topic. As before we get into our conversation, feel free to ask questions along the way. You can make comments as well. We'll try to address those if they're pertinent for the moment that we're at in our conversation. Liara Carter will help us out and interrupt us. And let us know, hey, this is a question that might fit right here. Otherwise, we'll save those questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together with a goal of being able to address all those questions and comments before we finish today. So before we begin our conversation, I want you to feel free. We have had good conversation along the way in the past, and I suspect that will continue. You can ask questions anonymously. You don't have to have your name associated with it if you feel more comfortable. Also note that the webcast conversations, this one and the ones before it, have all been recorded and posted on the website for our Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So for those of you who may have to stop at some point today for another meeting, or you missed one of our previous episodes, please, by all means, take a look at the previous ones that are posted online. So this week's guest is Dr. Kevin Gray from the University of Evansville's Department of Law, Politics, and Society. Dr. Kevin Gray is an associate professor of criminal justice and sociology at the University of Evansville. He earned his PhD from Michigan State University with dissertation research about how police services are delivered differently to different neighborhoods. So part of our conversation today will benefit from his expertise in this area. Dr. Gray also earned a master's in criminal justice from the University of Alabama and an undergraduate degree in sociology from Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. He began teaching at the University of Evansville in 2005. He teaches most of the criminal justice courses, including Intro to Criminal Justice, Deviance and Crime, Juvenile Delinquency, Corrections, and Policing. He also teaches the senior seminar course where sociology and criminal justice students develop and conduct and analyze their own research. Welcome, Dr. Gray.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Joining us again this week is Leara Carter. She's a recent graduate from Providence Cristo Rey High School in Indianapolis, Indiana, and will attend the University of Evansville this year as a freshman studying biochemistry. Leara is a new member of UE's Fellow Scholars Program, a program that was established in 2016 to improve the high school to college pipeline for domestic students of color. Leara continues to demonstrate her commitment to the university community by participating in conversations like this one that we're having today. And I always like to highlight that when Leara joins us, she has not actually, well, you started a class this summer, but she is a brand new student who is already active in the life of our community. So welcome, Leara.
Thank you.
So, Kevin, I'm going to call you Kevin because that's usually how we talk to each other. For those of you who are on the show here and watching, we have been colleagues since 2015. We were in the same department, and I thought it would be really beneficial if we start off by you just kind of giving a brief overview about the courses that you teach, and I'll mention too that the criminal justice program is a thriving program on our campus. I've always been impressed by the strength of the students that are a part of that program, and a lot of that has to do with how you recruit those students and just your teaching and those of the fellow faculty who help with that program. So can you give us a brief overview of those courses?
Sure. So the first class will be Intro to Criminal Justice. It's a broad overview of the justice system. We talk about general criminal justice issues at the beginning. Then we study the different components of the criminal justice system: policing, courts, and corrections, in that order, because that's how you progress through the system. That class is for it's for anyone who wants to take it. But I get a lot of non-majors that take that class just because it's interesting. There's always something going on culturally, that is relevant. That we always incorporate into that class. I also teach deviance and crime, which is essentially a criminology class. Theories of crime, whether those are biological, psychological, sociological, structural. It's a theory class. I don't have to talk to you about theory classes and students' interest in, but I like that class. I always say that we need to understand why people are doing what they do so that we have an appropriate response, and that our system reflects our theories. Back when we used to burn people, that reflected a theory. That system reflected a theory, and so our system now reflects our current understanding of why people engage in crime and deviance. I also teach juvenile delinquency. That's kind of a combination of the criminology class, because there's theory in that about why juveniles commit crime and a disproportionate amount of crime. And it also deals with the juvenile justice system, which is separate from the regular criminal justice system. Separate courts component and a separate corrections component, the same police. Although some places have juvenile units, it's the same police department. I teach corrections, which is about the different systems of punishment and treatment of offenders. I don't know why I said it like that. Maybe because traditionally we have been focused on punishment of offenders and less, rehabilitation, even though it's called corrections. But we study all sorts of programs, diversion programs that try to keep people out of the system, which are interesting. I think that's an interesting testament that we have diversion programs, because we recognize that the system can be damaging and have unintended consequences. Not everybody has to be locked up. And so we talk a lot about diversion programs. Those are especially prevalent for juveniles and first-time offenders. We talk about probation a lot. Probation, anytime I ask people in my classes, tell me what you know about corrections, they'll say prisons and jails, when the vast majority of people that are under correctional supervision are on probation. So we spend a lot of time talking about that, even, some serious offenders. And so probation is a significant area. And then also incarceration, just because that's interesting, right? And there's a lot of interest in that. So prisons and jails and issues with prisons and jails and private prisons, and also parole and aftercare programs. So those are the main criminal justice content related classes that I teach. We also offer in the program criminal law. We offer, they take the research sequence and then they complete their senior seminar.
Right.
Is that what you're looking for?
Oh, yeah, of course. And thank you for sharing that, because I think some folks on the call may not be aware of what we're talking about, especially the way in which we approach criminal justice as a program. So thank you for giving us that brief overview.
Yeah, can I just add one quick part?
Yeah.
I always tell people criminal justice isn't just about policing, although a significant portion of my students want to go into policing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about policing. And then I have to tell other people, you're not going to be a CSI, detective with your CJ degree.
Right.
Liara might would be in a better position with a biomedical degree.
Right.
So.
Right. So yeah, and some of your students have gone on to, obviously have gone into policing. Several have gone to law school. Some are in law school right now.
Sure.
That we know. And so the reason that I invited you to be a part of this conversation is, one, because I think you really can help us kind of understand, I guess, policing in one sense, but really to situate policing within this cultural moment. So, even with the intro that I gave and the one that's out in writing about, these tragic deaths, with the exception of Ahmaud Arbery, where the police have been involved, in several cases even prior to that, right? So I was thinking about, Philando Castile, and I was thinking of Sandra Bland, and so many others, where there was an interaction with the police that ended tragically. So I thought what would be probably a good place for us to start is recognizing kind of, especially with the most recent protests. I wonder if you could kind of talk about, reasons for why you think those protests emerged at that particular time.
Okay. Yeah, I would argue, I would not argue, but I would say that the Ahmaud Arbery case is also police related, right? Because
Sure.
one of the people involved was a former officer, which gets into a larger issue of kind of subculture. We talked about this a little bit the other day, how, there have historically been responses to police issues, since police were developed in the United States in the 1840s. People have been reluctant to, acquiesce to that authority, right? And it's a country founded on freedom and liberty. And if you put yourself back in that time frame, not too far removed from the Revolutionary War, 3 generations or so, a couple generations, the idea of an entity being able to tell you what to do, that was foreign to people, and contrary to what people imagined the country to be. And so police initially had a really tough time with legitimacy, and there was a lot of resistance to police. So since its inception, there's been resistance towards the police and active disdain and contempt and reluctance to cooperate with the police. Jump forward to the 60s and the riots. A lot of the riots in the 60s were sparked by police violence. And those had more of a localized flavor. I think with technology today, and especially with, how we've been locked up for months and isolated, and people are inundated with, media, interacting with the outside world through television or the internet, and hearing all of that and seeing the videos of it one after the other in terms of these events, and being shocked one after the other of those events, and it just seemed to boil over. And I think that in combination, with, just the history of it, and then the current context of everybody's been locked up and there's all this energy and confusion. I think that was just an intersection of many things, right? And then you had more of a nationalized response. So instead of, a riot or a protest, riot, I shouldn't use that word, instead of a protest in one particular area where the police incident or violence was, you had national and even international protest. And so that, that's technologically influenced. I think it's influenced by people's pent up frustration. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, and yeah, that's exactly what we were kind of having a conversation about. And I think it really does reveal a lot about the fact that we're in this moment where we've never faced this before, right? We've got, a global pandemic that has forced, many communities into isolation for public health reasons. I was thinking about, high unemployment and the pressures that places on people and families, communities, the way that has impacted, housing. I'm just waiting. I continue to keep my eye on reports about, how it was some cities put policies in place as stopgaps to be able to help those who are paying rent or unable to pay rent, and just seeing how at some point those landlords were going to need to be paid. And so that created this, so housing, the pressures that come with being unable to just, pay your bills, so to speak, or to have, food or schooling. So it's like every major institution was impacted by COVID. And then we had,
Right.
these events, these horrific events that took place. And you're right, that were all captured with social media using, video technology. And, I think I agree with you. It made for a very, this confluence, this specific moment in time where we certainly had some of these things taking place before, but because they happened in smaller pockets, and when I'm talking about some of these things, I'm saying, housing tensions, loss of employment, those types of things. But we've also had, these types of tragic events happening, specifically in with communities of color. And please note, for those of you on the call, I'm really expanding the range here. While many of the tragic cases that have been highlighted are specific to Black people, there have been brown people, so more broadly, so Black and brown people who have been experiencing the very same types of injustices within our society. So, Native Americans and Latinx and Hispanic folks, there has been an increase, especially since COVID-19, that Asian Americans have been facing lots of social issues because some see them as the ones who are responsible for this horrific disease, right? For this horrific virus. So yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for.
Can I interject?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Have you seen the CNN series Shades of America?
I've seen it, a couple of episodes, yes.
They started a new season, and recently, I think they were mostly filmed before the world fell apart. But the host, W. Kamau Bell, talked about, people don't protest, and I'm not doing what he said justice, but like people don't protest when they are, when their bellies are full and when their housing situation is great and when they have good jobs and when they're comfortable about their children, right? Recognizing, like you said, the confluence, which was the word I was looking for, of these problems that happened earlier in this year.
Right. So let's talk more about maybe police and policing as a transition. What are some historical reasons for why we even have the police? Like, how did we get to this moment? And to be fair, for those of you on the call, I'm often referencing conversations that I've had with our guests before we have the call. But something that I shared with Kevin was, when all of this was really taking place in March and April and before, I was really interrogating, the very motto that we see on police vehicles, right? To protect and serve. And I just started thinking, how did that even come about? Like, so, and this is not my background, this is not my area of expertise. So I thought it'd be great if Kevin could help us out here.
Okay. Yeah, and I think we talked about initially on a line of some of the defund the police
Yeah.
issues, which reminds me of why police were developed in the first place. So, in my intro to criminal justice or intro to sociology class, I always tell my students, like, if you ever get stuck on an answer in any of your classes, like why something happened, just put down industrialization and urbanization, right? And
Yes.
you'll probably be right.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the main reasons that policing developed. So we had informal systems of control that worked. People lived in small collections of people, and they could, watch out for each other and keep people in check. And sure, there were problems. As societies grew and as people lived in larger collections of people, those informal controls didn't work. And so places started to develop different types of social control. And there are intervening things like night watches and constables, and sometimes people were obliged or required to participate in guarding or in taking care of a community. People didn't like that necessarily, and so that led to them paying other people to take their turn, which led to a paid protection service. So that's part of it. That's part of it. The other part of it is that in the South, there were slave patrols. And when slavery was abolished, slave patrols, well, there's interesting documentaries and books on this, but slave patrols kind of branched into two directions. One branch went to early Southern police departments, and the other branch went to form the KKK. And I know when I teach that, students are just like, that's the history. Maybe it's not surprising to some. And so the earliest forms of policing were because we lived in larger collections, and informal controls didn't work, and formal controls were needed. And so in my class, I usually, in the policing class especially, I usually have an exercise that's like, what would happen if we didn't have the police? Are there other institutions or mechanisms that could function this way? Or, what would happen if we didn't have the police? What could we do to keep safe? And it's interesting because just about all of the things that people contribute or identify as things that we could do are things that used to be done and they didn't work, right? So we could rely on self-defense. Well, okay, that works, but then what happens? You have the strongest people have all your stuff. We could rely on voluntary watches, right? Well, not everybody wants to volunteer. We could rely on posses were a form of policing before official policing as a vocation. What might happen with that? What might happen with a mob or a lynch mob? And so there are issues with each of those mechanisms. They didn't work. They didn't provide fair systems for everyone. Neither did original policing, but at least it was a start. Because self-defense, everybody can't defend themselves. Voluntary is problematic. People's emotions get in the way if your system of protection is guided by individual grievance, and so you'd have disproportionate punishments. And so people looked at what would be an effective, fair, uniform system to help enforce norms and rules.
Yeah,
and so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there's a bit of bureaucracy there, right? So, and not in the negative sense, but the idea that a bureaucracy was supposed to be fairly predictable, right? So the people who were in those offices were not there necessarily because of, they knew someone in a position of power, so they got those positions. It was because of their credentials that then got them in those positions. This is a strictly, classical Weberian way of looking at bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But because the society was growing, right? So urbanization is taking place. People are moving around the globe. Communication is expanding. So there needed to be some way to be able to provide protection for people, right?
Well, it's funny you should mention that in terms of bureaucracies, because it took a while. We're such geeks because we like to talk about bureaucratization.
Right.
But it's funny you should mention not getting a job because someone you knew. That's exactly how early police got their jobs. That was the only credential they needed, was that their brother or neighbor or someone they went to church with or someone to whom they had contributed politically became police or police chief or mayor, and then they hired people they knew. And that was often ethnically, there were patterns ethnically and differential enforcement against other groups. There's differential enforcement across the board for that. And also, so there were no credentials to get hired other than you knew someone. There was also no training. And I think this is interesting in terms of, patterns of history. So not that I'm saying police aren't trained, but if you have police that aren't trained in a variety of techniques, what do you think they relied on? I do another exercise with my class when they're like, all right, let's say you're now the police officers at the University of Evansville. We have a police department. I'm going to give you guns and badges. People are going to resist. What are you going to do? And if you have no other training and no other tools in your kit, they responded with violence. And I think that's, has been a problem and continues to be a problem, but it was a founding problem. The bureaucratization of policing happened, and this goes back to your original question about serving and protecting. And so policing kind of, bumbled along through the 1800s. And then in the early 1900s, people started to bureaucratize the police. And there were people that wanted it to be more of a profession. And so they implemented training and credentialing. And then they focused also on law enforcement. That's, this era of policing is when they became known as law enforcement officers. And that's when that protect and serve, because they wanted to portray that balance and, try to epitomize what the police were there for. It was for protection and to serve the people, not the political machines or those in certain positions of authority, as it had been. So they wanted a, nonpartisan, equitable form of policing. And so it wasn't until the 1900s that policing became bureaucratized, and obviously struggled with, equal enforcement, and still does. So
let's talk about that a little bit. And there's a thought that did come up about, as you were talking about protect and serve, and we'll double back to that. But what about that? And this has, I guess, some connection to your dissertation research. Let's talk a little bit about that unequal enforcement. What do you mean by that? It makes sense to me, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so police have been studied for a while, and patterns of policing different neighborhoods have been studied, and different departments based on the composition of the population that they serve, and that different police departments provide different services. So if it's if the community is similar and less diverse, or if it's higher crime, if it's wealthier, if it's poorer, that, we don't have uniform police services. That sounds weird, but we don't have consistent police services across the United States. We have 16 to 17,000 different police agencies that are autonomous. They decide what they do. If the Evansville Police Department decided they wanted to have, 2-hour shifts and be all on foot patrol, and, carry a certain, well, it'd have to be constitutionally and state approved, but they could make those changes. And if Newburgh didn't want to do that, they could. And so you'd have cities with really disparate types of enforcement. And so my dissertation looked at, even within a city, could you identify neighborhood characteristics that were different, that impacted the delivery of police services? And what I found was that, not surprising because I predicted it, and it had been found before, but with different data, that in lower crime, higher income neighborhoods, police were less authoritative, and they also spent less time. So even though they might have been assigned to this neighborhood, they would often leave that neighborhood and go patrol other areas kind of where they thought they might find more action, is how I interpreted it.
Yeah. You know, I had shared this with you too, you know, just from a practical experience, and, you know, just recalling, you know, friends who have, you know, been a part of police departments in some cities that a city that I grew up in and have lived. And one time I remember one of my friends was, we were working on a project, and this friend was on call, and the radio was on, and I heard something that I had never heard before, and I started to ask some probing questions. What I was hearing was one call after the next on the radio that started off with, we have a call, you know, African American male, indecent exposure. We have a call, African American male, robbing a convenience store, brandishing a gun. Always started with African American male and then some type of activity, right? And I ended up asking my friend. I said, what is going on here? And you know, she wasn't really paying attention to it, other than the fact that, you know, it was on and needed to be responsive to it if it called for it. But I started asking questions that related to, you know, if you get a steady diet of that, right? The assumption is that, well, the ones to be on the lookout for would be African American males. And that made me ask questions about how precincts are created within some municipalities. And then, you know, a consistent diet of hearing the same information starts to give you you not predisposed, but you become really kind of tuned into, if there is criminal activity, it's coming from this type of person. And the only thing that I was trying to do as a budding sociologist was, I was recalling when I was in the Army and how the Army trained me as a soldier. And I shared this with you too. They would, in basic training, everybody had to pass this test on friend or foe, right? So they had a series of cards, and literally the stack of cards is like this, and they're like index cards that have silhouettes on them, and they showed, you know, tanks, aircraft, air defense artillery stuff, equipment, and all you had was the silhouette, and you had to name as many of them as possible within a short time period, if they were friend or foe. And the reason for that, at least the way that my brain was working when I was in basic training at 17 years old, was they need for us to be able to identify that when we're on the battlefield, who are friends and who are foes, because our very lives depend on it, right?
Yeah.
So then I pulled that into that conversation with my friend who was a police officer, and I said, is that what's kind of going on here? And while there wasn't much of a thought about that per se, there was the recognition that when there was a steady diet of hearing those messages, and not just, you know, a couple at a time, it was an 8-hour shift that they were hearing that. And so I think that, to add to the comments that you were making, I think that it makes a lot of sense that, you know, the police respond to calls, and yet there is also some potential implicit bias that's at play for some who are serving as police. Now, recognize that this isn't something that we're saying is widespread, but it does play a role, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you would get conditioned to that. And that was an issue. And, you know, research has shown that with police officers, you know, going back to the history of policing. So during that, you know, what's referred to as like the law enforcement phase, which is an odd thing to call it, but where they focused solely on law enforcement, what they found was that police officers were only dealing with people who were either accused of something or people who were in distress or victimized, right? And so that was a really narrow slice of a community. And what they found was that police developed really negative attitudes towards the community and towards the public in general, because you're only dealing with that slice. I analogize it to, like, if you worked at a call complaint center, like, I imagine you would just hate most people.
Yes.
And so, if you get that all the time, but if you get those calls all the time and that gets reinforced. And so some of the earliest changes in terms of how policing was done, like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that, would involve the community policing movement had to do with foot patrols. And people are like, oh, foot patrols, they're inefficient, right? They're unnecessary. It's, just symbolic. But what they found was it improved relationships between police and the community, because the police were able to interact with a wide range of people and not just a slice that was, problematic.
Right, right.
And so, if you're only getting that negative reinforcement or that reinforcement or conditioning of one type of person and only interacting with that one type of person, then how could you not generalize that?
Right. And that's the word I was after, right? That generalization, and especially if you see or have assessed that your life is at stake, right?
Right. And it works the other way around. So
right.
Citizens didn't like the police either, because they were only dealing with the police when police were coming in to, do a shakedown or hassle someone. And with foot patrol experiments, they found that citizens enjoyed interacting with the police.
Yeah.
And so, it was a win-win. And that, foot patrol and community policing they're not synonymous, but that led to some of the developments of community policing. Where it wasn't just about enforcing the law. And so, back to your original question about protecting and serving, a lot of that moved to, like community service and community partnerships in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to protect and serve. And, there are issues with that. There were some really heavy-handed forms of community policing that would lead to like stop and frisk. But there are other forms that involve neighborhood building and community building that showed some success and showed, different outcomes for citizens in those areas and for officers in those areas.
So you also mentioned, and I think I maybe knew this intuitively, but I didn't realize just the complexity. But there's different levels of policing as well, right?
Right. And that's you talk about what's going on in society today with criminal justice, like everything. So, highlighting the different levels of policing and issues of federal law enforcement coming into an area. I think that's how this topic came up, that, we don't have a national police. I drill that into my students' head all the time. They probably get tired of me saying it so much. But we don't have a national police. Federal agents don't run local departments. The Department of Justice doesn't. There are rules. There's the Constitution. There's Supreme Court rulings that they have to follow. But most departments, most police officers are local officers that are run by those 16 to 17,000 autonomous police agencies, and they do what they want. You have state police that have statewide authority, but technically local police have statewide authority in most places. But when you get to the federal level, federal police, federal law enforcement have really specific jurisdictions, and they have really specific duties. So, they're not full general service police officers. They can't arrest you for any federal crime. When Congress passes a law, they identify the enforcement agency that would be involved in that. So if it had to do with guns or explosives, it would be the ATF and E. If it was drugs, it would be the DEA. If it was white collar, it could be FBI. It might be Secret Service, right? And so they have limited areas. They're not these full service police providers, unless martial law is declared. Then the military can step in. But the issues that are going on in Portland, and then I don't know if I would call it threats to send in federal officers to other places to restore order.
Yeah,
that's a local police function, and in most places they're doing fine with it. So, did that answer what you were getting at?
Yes, and I think where I wanted to go with this too was, Portland is a great example, and you're exactly right. The reports that, federal officers would be sent into major cities like Chicago in order to restore order. Even in the civil rights era, we had at least the, National Guard was was activated in order to attempt to quell, you know, protests and social unrest, and during the period of integrating schools, and we see both the police and, you know, the National Guard involved. So historically,
Right.
we've got this very interesting connection to both policing and law enforcement at both the local and federal level, especially for communities of color, which I find very interesting historically.
Yeah.
And that history is not lost on people of color today. I think that sometimes folks would wish that, you know, like the past didn't exist, but it does exist, and it really informs the moment we are in today. And communities of color in particular have a very good memory.
Sure.
And the reason is because the patterns have been not just set, but those patterns have been reinforced over time and time again. So I think that's what's been really striking to me. But I think
What
this. Go ahead.
I was just going to say another issue, you know, that has developed from the earliest policing until now has been accountability. That there's always been problems with the police. Earliest police, there was no accountability. Later on, when the reforms were put in, there were disciplinary procedures, there were internal affairs units, there were civilian commissions, there were federal commissions that looked into what was going on, what caused all of these riots, and so there was, you know, accountability. And I always talk about that, like, oh yeah, our system has problems, but there's accountability. The worst case scenarios are, you know, even with death row exonerations, that's, you know, there's still some accountability, and there's, you know, some solving of an injustice. Tell that to someone that spent 20 years on death row, it's, you know, small solace. But, you know, in terms of accountability and policing, police officers being identified, documenting what they do, filling out reports, you know, they have badges with numbers and IDs, and the, you know, the anonymity of some of the policing and activities, that was disturbing. You know, there are reports that I read in the, you know, the Lafayette Square issue in DC that agents would be asked, you know, who are you? Who do you work for? And they say, we work for the federal government, right? So you don't have an identification badge number. So how are those people held accountable?
Right.
And in Portland, they had, you know, unmarked officers, unidentifiable. So, you know, that's problematic.
Right. I was wondering if we could transition a little bit and talk about how that, at least at the level of law enforcement, how it relates to immigration. And we did talk a little bit about this, and also decided there are no shortage of topics, right? We can keep going. But let's kind of pick up post 9/11, right? So we've got a Homeland Security that started. We've got Borders and Customs. We've got ICE, and some of these organizations have a bit more, direct connection to what we're doing with immigration enforcement, right?
Sure.
How is this playing out, I guess, with, and maybe this would be a good place to talk about implicit bias a bit more.
Okay, so after September 11th, the Department of Homeland Security was created. There was a lot of reshuffling of federal agencies because of the lack of information that had been shared prior to 9/11, and that, you know, different agencies had little pieces of that puzzle, but no one put them together. That's what the Department of Homeland Security was going to do, and so they theoretically put all the agencies that would be responsible under the, you know, umbrella agency of the Department of Homeland Security, and they did put a lot of them under there. But they didn't put the FBI under there. Kind of territorial, you know, issues, in my opinion, and that's a huge agency that deals with those types of threats. But what's also interesting, but with the creation of that, people, a lot of people were against the creation of this huge new agency, these new or increased numbers of officers, the levels of control that were going to be put into place. People were really reluctant about that, all this big brother stuff. So I find it fascinating now that people are accepting of federal police coming into local areas, but I digress on that. And so with the Department of Homeland Security, things were shuffled around. More money went to certain agencies. So, you know, previously, like FBI was in like postal inspectors had the largest numbers of federal officers historically, but afterwards, the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs, those numbers jumped way up in terms of their levels of enforcement. It's my understanding that those were the officers that were used with the U.S. Marshals to go to Portland. And that highlights what I was trying to convey earlier about the different areas that they would be responsible for. U.S. Marshals are responsible for the federal courts, right? So they're still there protecting that federal courthouse and the area surrounding it if people were trying to attack it. But, they don't have rights to go away from that courthouse and do these things. And so from what I've read, the Immigration and Customs and the border protection people were ones that were used primarily in Portland, which is interesting to think about, especially psychologically and sociologically. If you think about, what they do on a day-to-day basis and how their job is kind of an us versus them, right? And that's been a huge issue with policing since policing started, us versus them, and that mentality. And people try to break down that mentality because it should be, people in the community working with the police, but that those specific agencies are used and would have theoretically a higher mentality of us versus them, I think adds to the problems. From my point of view, it might be beneficial from someone else's point of view.
Yeah. So we've got a few moments here, and Liara, I just see that some questions have popped up. There has been some comments, and I wonder if we can go through and see if we can address those.
Sure. So our first question is mainly discussing Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, focused on Sandra Bland's arrest, policing techniques, probation hearings, etc., and is very interesting. It seems like a police technique of stopping or questioning people was used during the Bland arrest, but was not appropriate for the location where she was stopped. This person is curious about how law enforcement agencies evaluate their techniques, especially when techniques go horribly wrong, like the one with Sandra Bland.
That is so fascinating because I've read that book, and when I was kind of preparing for this talk, that book came to mind again. So for those of you who have not read it, I strongly encourage you to read Malcolm Gladwell's book called Talking to Strangers. He spends a considerable amount of time talking about the Sandra Bland case that took place in Texas and ended in her hanging herself, or at least there was the concern that either she was killed in police custody or she committed suicide. But Gladwell does a really good job of unpacking why he thinks that took place, and it's kind of embedded in the name of the book, Talking to Strangers, which is supposed to be a sequel to his book called Blink. Do you want to take a stab at this one?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure. It is a great book. I recommend it to everyone. We'll probably incorporate it into one of my classes. So what Gladwell talked about in that book was that there was, departments promoted and highlighted, we have this real effective way to control crime. And it's super aggressive, stopping people and finding out if they have any reason to arrest them, right? And that worked in some really specific high crime places, and crime rates lowered. What other departments learned was that, hey, we should try this in our low crime departments where there aren't these problems. And it created a lot of problems. It created hostility. It created a lot of differential enforcement, profiling. That book did a fantastic job. It kind of breaks your heart to go through. And he quotes and has the dialogue between the officer and Sandra Bland, and says, at this point, it could have gone in this other direction.
That's right.
At this point, it could have gone in this other direction. And so, it revolves a lot around de-escalation. I don't know if you had like police officers or police trainers on here. I think like de-escalation is kind of like how community policing was in the 90s. It's kind of like, oh, of course, that's what you're going to say. But there's something to the idea of de-escalating. And that officers aren't trained in de-escalation the same way they're trained in asserting their authority.
Yeah.
Which is what the officer did in that case. And then for what she got out of his way because he was kind of speeding up behind her, and so changed lanes without using a turn signal, and she ended up in jail, which, you know, would be traumatic. And yeah.
It was like one tragic, you know, ingredient added to that pot each time.
Yeah.
Leah, is there another one?
Yes, there's actually a lot of questions coming in. So there's also a follow-up question to that question. It says, do the consequences justify the actions taken? It seems like the public might want those actions to be taken regardless of the harm that could be done to innocent people living in those areas.
So do the consequences justify the actions taken?
Not right now.
Yeah.
I would say no, because obviously sometimes they do, right? You get bad people off the street. But when it infringes on people's other rights or their life, then obviously it doesn't justify it, right? If we wanted to end all drug use right now, we could go door to door, you know, search every house, but we don't want to do that. You know, we'd find some drugs, right? We'd get some bad people off the street. But, you know, if you cast too broad of a net, you're going to have all sorts of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think something else that was really striking to me in Gladwell's book was just how poorly we assess people we don't know. So we do one of two things, right? We either, if they have certain characteristics that we deem as good or professional characteristics, we accept them wholeheartedly, probably more than we should. So if they speak well, if they're dressed nicely, if they have a quote unquote good pedigree, we'll allow them to babysit our kids, even when we don't even know who they are. But we're also really, really bad at reading body language from people that we don't know. And I think this is where he really did talk about the Sandra Bland case, for an example. In the conversation between the officer and Sandra Bland, at one point she lights a cigarette, and the officer interpreted that as a sign of disrespect toward his authority, and then that escalated the entire problem. And so that was one of those moments where Gladwell kind of, you know, speaks into that particular space and says, or in that specific instance, and says, hey, that would be a place where this could have gone a completely different direction if they understood, if that officer understood why she was lighting a cigarette, right? It had nothing to do with disrespect. It had a lot to do with nerves and anxiety about being stopped by the police in a state that she had just moved to, so on and so forth. I'm seeing other questions, so Leah, please go ahead. Let's see if we can get as many of these taken care of.
Okay, so this next question deals with accountability. It says, if the laws are in place for accountability, how or should the public ensure they are enforced because they are not?
Well, every department has accountability mechanisms where officers have to identify themselves, indicate, you know, who they are, who they work for. And that was a problem with some of the recent protest control, that those officers were not identifiable. So how could you hold them accountable? Other than that people, you know, had video evidence of these officers, and could, you know, use social media maybe to hold people accountable. But if officers aren't identifying themselves, you can't hold them accountable. Otherwise, there are mechanisms, you know, complaint mechanisms if officers have done something, or you know, that different departments have different routes that would proceed through. But all departments have that.
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting that, you know, the difficulty of when those officers are not even identifiable, unless you have, you know, video or some type of visual evidence to show these are the people who did whatever.
Right.
I think it also connects to, you know, in the Breonna Taylor case, that was as tragic as it was, right? The police were involved, and, you know, every possible thing that could have gone wrong went wrong in that case.
Yeah.
And you know, the ongoing protests that have been happening in Louisville, which is what, 2 hours away from us, it's been striking to see how what the public has been asking for. And granted, there's been a new policy that's been passed by the mayor there. It's being enforced by the police department, LMPD. What's been really interesting, the people have remained involved. And I think to address that question, I think that's something that some of the protests I think are focused on that, right? So it's not just there are those formal mechanisms by which to hold officers accountable, but in those cases where things go terribly wrong or there is an injustice that takes place, the public should stand up, right? And they're demonstrating that there's ways to be able to do that without that kind of leading to violence. So that's been an interesting development that's very local for us. I mean, it's not in Evansville, but it is 2 hours away.
And if police departments won't do anything about it, mayors appoint police chiefs, or some city council will. And so there are political implications.
Right. And we have seen evidence of police chiefs being fired across the country.
Mm-hmm. There's also issues with the district attorney in terms of accountability. Sometimes if it's a racially charged case, a district attorney might be reluctant because he or she's elected and they don't want to offend so a previous question asked, don't some people like this? Sometimes the district attorney will take a case to a grand jury as opposed to pursuing, charges automatically. And so then that they can say, well, the grand jury decided that this was, justified or whatever, and not have to. And that happened with the Michael Brown case recently.
Right. That's right. Recently. Lyra, are there some others where it looks like there's some similar questions that they're asking?
Yes, there's mainly some of them talking about defunding the police, and where Dr. Gray's thoughts on that.
Sure.
So I see Maggie's question, and I agree. And some places are doing that. So Maggie asked or refers to defunding the police. I have a couple of thoughts. I think the charge or that the terminology is problematic just because people will, it's already been politicized to say people want to get rid of all the police. And then people say, no, that's not what they mean. They mean to, reduce or change or reorient the police. And so the idea of defunding the police is, problematic because that's not going to happen. We need the police. But prioritizing other agencies that deal with these situations, absolutely. And like I said, some places do this. There are medium and large size cities that have domestic abuse response teams where counselors go with the officers. They're not the first ones through the door, right? But once the situation is calmed down, then those counselors talk to the parties involved. And sure, it would be better, right? As someone who has degrees and experience with counseling, working with domestic violence or mental health issues and mental health services, they're going to be, so much more effective than a police officer. And that's not to denigrate police officers, but they deal with a wide range of issues. And so people with specializations that have more direct experience with those issues and know how to work with people and solve those problems, of course, that would be better. I don't know that we have a good model for how that plays out. I think the domestic violence response part works. Yeah. But there's an immediacy, which is why we have police, right? That something's happening right now that needs to be taken care of, whether it's, domestic violence or mental health or some other issue. And, the police aren't going to be the best ones geared towards handling that. So how do you get from, get that from the police to those agencies more effectively, and also fund those agencies so that they can address it? I hope that made sense.
Yeah. And there's some larger questions here, and we're about out of time. So I want to at least respect the time for folks who are on here. We'll see if we can address some of those questions offline if you've left your information there. But let me first thank you, Kevin, for being a part of this conversation today and guiding us. Lyra, thank you. A lot of questions and comments along the way here. So just as a recap, over the month of July, we have engaged in several conversations that touch on race in America and how we as a university are considering its impacts on race relations for our students and our employees and the community at large. As an institution of higher education, it is crucial that we understand our role in the midst of racial injustices. Make no mistake here, folks, we cannot stop police brutality. We can't stop racial injustice or the systematic destabilization of communities of color directly. However, we can educate and train future police officers, lawyers, and criminal justice professionals to think critically and act ethically to transform our flawed systems. We can encourage our students in sociology and political science, foreign languages, engineering, healthcare, education, and business to be good instead of looking good. We stop systematic racism, prejudice, discrimination, and racial violence when we challenge our students to gain clear understanding of themselves and the historical and present issues of our time. We stop these social problems when we provide space for our students to be uncomfortable by engaging those who are unlike them. These efforts are not clearly reflected in a course grade or fulfilled in a class requirement. The goal is far bigger. It's more profound and far more lasting if we allow it to be. We aim for our students, both current and future, and our future politicians, educators, counselors, professional athletes, actors, engineers, scientists, accountants, and many of whom will be parents and community members and leaders to participate in an incredibly complex and changing world. That's what we do. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to picking up the conversation in this forum in the months to come, so be on the lookout for announcements about what we're going to do for the rest of the semester. Dr. Gray, thank you once again. Liara, thank you. And
you're welcome.
Thank you for participating. We look forward to connecting in the future. Take care.
Thank you.